Hello, my name is Richard Grannon. Welcome to episode 3 of the R complex, where we will be exploring the way in which people who are fixated in the reptilian part of their brain, they're obsessed rigidly with primal survivalist level mentalities of ruling the world. They're obsessed with their own dominance and they're completely addicted to power in the way that we would describe in psychology a narcissistic psychopath. There are certain terms that I'd like to clarify. The term archon, it's Greek and it literally translates as Lord. In the Gnostic texts, the archons were understood to be demonic figures that were manifestations of the demiurge, the false god of the false reality that we find ourselves living in now. So that's what an archon is. The term monarch or hierarchy, they all relate to this. For the purpose of this series, we decided to call them, as in narcissism, narcons. Narcissism, also a Greek word. It's based on the Greek myth of a chap called Narcissus. He was a hunter, allegedly from Laconia, where Sparta is located in ancient Greece, and he was particularly beautiful. And with his beauty, he fell in love with his own image. And in falling in love with his own image, he was typically very cruel to female suitors who came to him to tell him that he was beautiful, they wanted to be with him. And in some mythologies, he caused the suicides of many of these women. One of the goddesses, Aphrodite, heard of this and sent one of her manifestations to punish him. One day, after he'd been out hunting, he was particularly thirsty and he came upon a pool of water. She caused him to look into the pool, to see his own reflection, and to fall in love with the beautiful man that he saw there in the full bloom of his youth. Remaining trapped there, he realized that the love of this image would never reciprocate, and in the fire of his own passion, he died and was consumed in his own fire and turned into a flower, which we now know as the Narcissus. Narcissistic personality disorder, as developed by and popularized by Sigmund Freud as a personality disorder, is characterized by a very rigid way of interacting with reality that depends on the individual gazing lovingly at their own reflection. So the individual is only ever really viewing reality as a reflection of themselves. So they actually can't see reality as it is. It's a very lonely personality disorder in which there's just one person there. Where does this happen in the development of a human being? Well, typically this happens very, very young, usually before the age of 4. So in the timeline of a human being, before they hit the age of 4 years, some trauma, some incident causes them to become stuck in their development. They get trapped in a state of arrested development where they cease to be able to distinguish between themselves and what the psychiatrists call objects around them. Objects in the context of psychiatry, itself a quite narcissistic practice with using narcissistic language, refers to people. So the baby cannot tell the difference between its own self and the people around it. It's supposed to, in a healthy environment, individuate. It never completes individuation. So when we think of narcissistic people, we think that their ego is big and strong and fully formed. Actually, that's not true. It's very small, very fragile, very weak, and has multiple fractures in it. It's so fragile and has so many fractures inside of the ego boundaries that they see the world and themselves as one entity. That's why when we're talking about the narcons coming from the R complex part of the brain, the reptilian, ancient part of the brain that was developed in an extremely harsh environment that's extremely primal and violent and is all about a brutal battle for limited resources, the people who are stuck in this modality, they effectively develop narcissism because they're so rigid, they're so stuck in the infancy of evolution as a human, as an animal, that they're actually stuck back in our evolutionary infancy in a reptilian state. Reptilian is not particularly intelligent. Well, those amongst you who are intelligent would then ask, but if you're telling us they're stuck in a primal state where they lack imagination, they lack an ability to reason, they lack empathy, why do they run the world? Well, because we're in an environment where if you rush first to take power against people who do have all of their faculties, who are thinking about the pros and cons, how it'll affect the people around them, whether they're qualified for it, you'll win. And the more savage you are, you'll win. We don't have the best of us in power, we have the greediest of us in power. We don't have the best of us in power, we have those who lust for the power most aggressively in power. We have the most aggressive, the most damaged, the most infantile, the most competitive. They're the ones who are in power, and that's why the world looks the way that it does. So narcissism as a personality disorder means that the person is completely in love with their own reflection. There's no room for them to see anybody else. They see the world as a mirror, as multiple manifestations of themselves, and they can only handle reality and other people in that reality in one way. And that is through purely vertical relationships. When the narcissistic psychopath, when the Narchontic archetype talks about equality, when they want to say this is equal, what they mean is they are up here and you are down there. To the narcissist and the psychopath and the Narchontic type, this is what equal looks like. You're further down the hierarchy than them. Whenever you come along and you as a human being try to do equal with them, like you speak to them as though you're on an equal footing, only two things will happen. One is they'll be bewildered and confused. The second thing is they'll get very angry and they'll punish you. That anger that they experience is called narcissistic rage. When they experience narcissistic rage, it's because they perceive that your treatment of them is disrespectful. So in their world, treating them as an equal is a horrendous insult. In their world, treating them as an equal or as a human being, as worthy of respect as you are.
A daughter! Who cares as much about the beautiful dresses I give her as she cares about me? What's wire hangers doing in this closet? Answer me!
You are actually inflicting something called narcissistic injury.
I buy you beautiful dresses and you treat them like they were some dish rag. You do. $300 dress on a wire hanger.
Now, my hypothesis is that the people who we have in charge of us, these emotional infants, the people who are fundamentally retarded, as in held back in their growth and in a state of arrested development, are so held back that they're trapped in this reptilian part of the brain, this reptilian way of thinking, and they're traumatized in order to be there typically. They're in love with their own self-image. And every day and every moment that they're awake and conscious and interacting with reality, of course reality pushes back and says, you're not special, you're not the king, you're not the queen, you're just another human being. And it triggers them into multiple narcissistic injuries, and they go into a narcissistic rage. Here's something for you that'll give you a little bit of an edge on everybody who wants to talk about narcissism as though they know everything about it. Something that's very, very rarely mentioned, but it's very, very important, and it's called ideas of reference. Now, like a lot of the language in psychiatry, it doesn't really give you much of a clue as to what that might mean, but what ideas of reference is when somebody has narcissistic personality disorder, they're coming from the reptilian part of the brain. Ideas of reference means they think everything that occurs in reality is referring to them. Why? Because they have dreadful ego boundaries. They do not have the ego boundaries of an adult, and they think everything is all about them all the time. One great way of inflicting narcissistic injury and inducing narcissistic rage is to remind the person it's not all about you, not all the time. time, that would be very upsetting to them. You might think that's a sane statement, that's a rational statement. Couldn't possibly be about me all the time, couldn't possibly be about you all the time. That's reasonable, right? You don't want to be reasonable, because you can only be reasonable with an equal on a horizontal transactional footing. That sends them into a rage. And then, because they're injured, they'll want to take revenge. This is an extremely vengeful mindset. Why are they so brutal with the rest of humanity? Why are they so vengeful? Why so nasty? Why not just quietly take power, enjoy the power, and leave it? This is where we have to address the fact that it's not just narcissism that we're dealing with, it's psychopathy. And because it's psychopathy, their lust for power and their greed is without boundaries. If it was pure narcissism, my contention is that with narcissism, if the narcissist gets the supply that they're looking for, that would be if you kowtow to them, which is a Cantonese for bowing and showing deference, so you kowtow, they will be satisfied. A pure narcissist, eventually you can satiate them. You can. Depending where on the spectrum, there's multiple forms of narcissism, but typically a straightforward, classic, grandiose, overt narcissist, they can be satiated. The psychopath can never be satiated. The rage and the injury and the desire for vengeance they experience, if nobody in the environment triggers them, they trigger themselves with these bizarre, delusional ideas of reference. If nobody's actually triggering them, they'll make it up. Without wanting to get too complicated, people who are very traumatized and stuck in this R complex, whose ego boundaries are weak, what happens is they experience a stream of negative, delusional, illusional impulses from inside the brain. They're called introjects. Everything else here is important to know, that's less important to know, but an introject one example of an introject would be if you had an abusive father and he would physically and verbally abuse you and tell you you're worthless. If you replayed the recording saying I'm worthless, that would be one example of an introject. These people are getting introjects based on their entitlement. Another somewhat nuanced, slightly complicated thing that needs to be understood is that spoiling a person is also abuse. This is not well understood, but spoiling, when you give too much to a child, this must be understood as something that leads to them being fixated in the reptilian complex, of falling in love with themselves, and it must be understood as a form of abuse. Entitlement is a key marker for narcissism and psychopathy, and particularly for the third thing that we're talking about for the narcons, narcissistic psychopathy. This is narcissism weaponized. This is psychopathy blended with a dangerous mix of vanity, because a straight psychopath is not vain. A straight psychopath is a goal-orientated entity, much like the Terminator. The term psychopath, as we deal with it nowadays in psychology, is fundamentally, historically, and culturally rooted on the archetype of the American prison system. So whatever you would think of as the median, statistical median for the person who ends up long-term trapped in the American penal system by view of their entitlement, their ideas of reference, their low impulse control is another marker, out of control, emotional dysregulation, so on and so forth. That's the standard for a psychopath. It's a criminal, it's a boundary breaker, and they effectively become addicted to breaking boundaries. That's why they're in jail. Narcissists usually don't go to jail. Narcissists are usually smart enough to protect the self-image so that they don't get caught and they don't transgress legal boundaries. They just trample on every moral boundary they can. They'll usually be interviewed by the police at some point in their life. They'll usually push it to a degree, but they very rarely go to jail. The psychopath, by definition, is a criminal, and a criminal who gets caught. Impulse control is low, rage is very high, emotional dysregulation is high, extremely materialistic, extremely power driven, and also sadistic. Narcissists usually not sadistic. Psychopaths, very sadistic. Narcissists are vengeful to regain their power, their place in the power hierarchy for vanity and for their self-image. The psychopath wants power. You combine these two together, it's a very dangerous mix.
Tell me in a sentence who you are.
Nobody. It's particularly savage. So what we have here is a situation where you have this perfect storm of negative traits, but one of the things I wanted to just close this out by mentioning is entitlement, being spoiled. What do you see now across the globe? What do you see as a major cultural issue that we face? Where has prolific, unboundaried use of social media led us? This thing that we hold in our pockets, this black mirror that we carry around as the series was named for, where does it lead us to? What is social media for, other than to say, look at me, look at me, look at me, and help me look at myself through your eyes via likes and follows? It's hierarchical, is it not? It's hierarchical in its essence. How many followers do you have? How many likes do you get? How many views did you get? It's a competition to go up the totem pole, up the social hierarchy, to be bigger than everybody else. And if you start to come down, oh no, narcissistic injury, narcissistic rage kicks in. I would suggest that it's been a deliberate, planned, propaganda-based mind control psyop from the outset to push the social media agenda in a way that makes us look more like them. Because if we look like humans, we'll be harder to control and harder to predict. Nothing is easier to predict than a lizard. Nothing is easier to predict and control than somebody who's stuck in this infantilized R-complex state. They don't want you accessing the mammalian and human parts of your brain. They don't want you cooperating and showing love to other people. They don't want you thinking of we. They want you focused on me. And I think what's happened observably, verifiably, it's hard to deny, that in the last 15 years, our entitlement, our coddling, our spoiledness has gone through the roof. And with the speed at which we can get things done and access to narcissistic supply through the flick of a thumb, we're actually also, our impulse control is coming right down. Our ability to delay gratification is coming right down. Our concentration is coming right down. In essence, ladies and gentlemen, I'm saying we're becoming more aggressive, less patient, more vain, more entitled, more spoiled, less kind, more focused on sex, more focused on money, more focused on materialism, more focused on power, and less focused on community and kindness and humanity. The humanity is slowly being beaten out of us. This is the Narchontic agenda in essence. So there are a few terms that you need to understand. I think if you have the words to understand these things, you can control it and you can fight it. If you can name the demon, you can tame the demon. If you can name the demon, you can shame the demon as well. So you can point out what people are doing, and then you're not at the mercy of it. When you don't know and you're not armed with the weapons that words are and the concepts, then you're kind of at the mercy of them. So there's a few things here that I want to talk to you about. One of them is a term that is very, very useful, which is when people go into denial about how bad the narcissistic abuse is, when people go into denial about what people are doing when they're stuck in the R complex. And people will. They will go into denial because they don't want to look at the horror of the reality, not the reality that's coming, the reality that we already live in. People are in massive denial about how awful this particular mode of living is. And that is a term called malignant optimism. So if a human being, an individual, is in a relationship with a narcissist or indeed a narcissistic psychopath, and they're living with them on a day-to-day basis, sometimes that individual that they're in the abusive relationship with is going to show up as nice and good and sometimes as bad. over a period of time, when the abuser shows up as both good guy and bad guy, this creates an effect called trauma bonding, which is not a term from mainstream psychology. It's actually a term from cult psychology, from the psychology of cults and how cults work and how to bring people out of them. So typically what happens in a cult is when you first arrive, you'll be love bombed. You'll be surrounded by people who are telling you you're wonderful, that you've made it, that you're the one, that this is going to be heaven on earth for you. And then eventually either somebody in the cult or indeed the cult leader will treat you poorly and well. They'll show up as an angel and a demon. They'll show up both as a tormentor and a rescuer, so that over time your ego boundaries break down and you get reduced back down to an infantile state. Do you see the themes that are coming up again and again? I'm good, I'm bad, I'm breaking ego boundaries, and I need to take people back to childhood. You take them from adulthood, you drag them by the hand through adolescence by getting them obsessed with sex. You get them obsessed with money, you get them obsessed with status signaling, which is what adolescence is for, but you're supposed to grow out of it. And then once you've dragged them down through adolescence, you can then take them further and further down and back and back and back until they're in a pre-toddler state. Total submission to daddy and mummy. Cannot feed myself, cannot help myself, that's the end goal. Trauma bonding allows you to do that. Malignant optimism is when the person has been so trauma bonded to their abuser, they're convinced that the abuser is not abusing them. Your government loves you. Your government is full of good people doing the best they can. Sure, they make mistakes, but they're not deliberately trying to hurt you. They're just doing the best they can with the resources they have available to them, same as everybody else. That is malignant optimism. Or they tell you, yeah, it's not great now, but as soon as we voted this one out and we get the next ones in, everything's going to be great. Malignant optimism. Politicians play up to this. They'll say things like, it's time to change.
We have been told by the cynics that you can't build change from the bottom up. But one of the things that I've learned as a community organizer is that it is the American people who are the true agents of change in this country.
Let's have a change. That sucked. It won't with me. Let's change things up. And everybody goes, yay! Malignant optimism. It's going to be different this time. No, it isn't. That's what people who are stuck in abusive relationships say every time they go back to their abuser, to the bewilderment and terror of family and friends. Why are you going back to him? He beats you. Oh, well, it was my fault and I do upset him and it'll be different this time. That's trauma bonding, and that is malignant optimism. I want to talk to you very quickly about something else that is becoming more and more important in society now, which is this thing called signaling. Social media is not a platform for communication. That is a lie. That is the big lie of social media. Oh, it's for connecting and communicating. Nonsense. It is a platform for signaling. What's the difference? Chatting is a signal and it's communication, right? Signaling in biology is what animals do to each other. If an animal is going to signal something to another animal, it's not a communication of a concept, it's a communication of a state, and usually of hierarchy, which is why all social media is about nothing but status. I mean, it's right there in the name on Facebook. What's your status today? Are you going to update your status? Well, let me see how many views and followers and likes I got. Then I can update my status. They're not even trying to hide it. The currency of social media is likes. What else could we call likes? Validations. What else is a validation? Signaling. That's the other monkeys in the troop saying, you're the bigger monkey. I offer you my follow. I offer you my like. I offer you this validation. Signaling when it's time to mate. The females will signal to the males that they're ready. This can be done through pheromones, it can be done through movement, it can be done through certain displays, certain behaviors, smells, visual signals, but it's a signal of a state of being ready for something. It's a signal of a status. The males can come along and they can tussle with each other, they can fight with each other, they can show you their horns, they can puff up depending on the species that we're talking about. God knows there's even fish that will draw pictures in the sand on the ocean bed to show how good a mate that they'll potentially be. That's a signal. It's to say, mate with me, I'm worth mating with. It's a signal of a status. So be careful with social media, be careful with the way communication is going now. We're being indoctrinated, we're being slowly conditioned to replace actual communication of concepts with signaling. Signaling is only ever about showing what your status is in the dominance hierarchy. And what are one of the words that we're using nowadays to reflect this? That's not a communication, that's a virtue signal. Virtue signaling may as well be called status signaling, because the more virtuous you are now in this, I think it would be fair to say, is a more leftist worldview, a more social justice warrior, postmodern worldview, is virtue is the most important thing. And they're the ones who tell you what the virtues are, by the way. You don't get to choose your virtues. You can't show up and say, well, my virtues are discipline, competition, and honesty. No, no, no. They'll tell you what the virtues are, and they tend to be leftist virtues. I say this as a left-leaning person in my politics. So it's actually virtue signaling is really status signaling. How virtuous you are determines how high up the totem pole of hierarchy of status of virtue you can go. This is replacing genuine communication, and it's a problem. It's partly indoctrination by social media, and it's partly indoctrination in mainstream media. Don't communicate, signal. It's the death of truth. In an environment where everybody's signaling and nobody's communicating, truth is one of the first casualties to go down. So we can actually say that in a very real sense, this is an information war, this is a communication war, and the end goal is your personal intellectual space, your ego boundaries, your intellectual boundaries, and your intelligence. They're trying to kill any kind of genuine communication, which includes polite, reasoned discussion and debate, and replace it with empty, cheap virtue signaling, which is actually, in fact, status signaling, which is something only animals do.
Stick to